What if the Silk Road didn't begin with silk, or even with China? Centuries before empires, riders crossed the Bronze Age steppe, trading metal for salt, horses for stories. From their paths emerged the first real network, camps, fords, and corridors that would one day form the spine of Eurasia. Han China would inherit those routes, Parthia would profit from them, and Rome would depend on them, without ever knowing their origins. Across these tracks, faiths and technologies spread like rumors. Plagues and philosophies traveled side by side. The Silk Road wasn't built, it evolved. And if you've ever wondered how empires tapped into roads they didn't lay, or how connection itself became the engine of history, this story rewires the map you think you know. Before the word road meant stone pavements and mile markers, the Eurasian steppes formed a living corridor, grass stretching from the Carpathians to Mongolia. These open belts linked river worlds without building a single bridge. When rainfall shifted and pastures moved, people moved with them, and the routes stitched distant valleys into one space. Cut between maps of the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, and then back to the wide grass, the arteries were real, even if no empire surveyed them. Nomadic groups learned how to turn that space into an asset. Cultures we label as Yamnaya, Afanasyevo, and later Andronovo organized herds, wagons, and camps around seasonal rhythms. They experimented with harnessing and steering power, first by yoking animals to wheeled carts, then by refining control with bits and bridles. A family could shift an entire household in a day, and with it, move stone tools, metal ingots, and stories. Mobility became leverage because they could carry news across distances that farmers measured in harvests. Trade began as neighbors meeting at pasture edges. But those meetings stretched into chains across thousands of kilometers. Tin for bronze did not sit near copper deposits. Obsidian flaked best for blades. Jade carried ritual value in the East. Lapis lazuli gleamed from mines in Central and South Asia. Each material had a source far from its users, which pushed herders to serve as connectors. A single wagon train might leave with raw copper nodules and return with nodules worth of social capital, new songs, forging tricks, and gossip about fresh grazing. Those chains linked early centers. From Mesopotamian cities came beads and metalwork. From the Indus Valley came carnelian and standardized weights. Farther east, communities that would later feed into Chinese states valued jade and fine stone. None of this required a charter or a toll gate. It required time, water, and animals that kept moving. When a pass thawed, word traveled. When a river dropped, routes adjusted. Over centuries, these adjustments solidified into predictable segments known to certain families and clans. The horse turned segments into a network. Around 3500 to 3000 BCE, riding shortened delays between camps. Scouts could map water points ahead, and messengers could recall a herd before a storm. Breeding choices favored temperaments and endurance suited to long runs and cold winds. Studies of horse DNA point to a dominant domestication event on the steppe in this period, meaning most modern horses share roots in a single region. In practice, that meant one engine model spread across the continent, with parts interchangeable and maintenance shared by anyone who knew pasture and grain. Riding also changed risk. A mounted escort deterred theft. Faster travel reduced spoilage of perishable goods carried for the journey. Chasing seasons let caravans thread between winter deserts and summer insects. And the social side mattered. Herders who traded stallions and mares built relationships as strong as contracts because the next fold tied partners together for years. Language may have moved along these paths too. Early Indo-European varieties appear to ripple across the steppe and into both Europe and South Asia, suggesting that words rode in the same carts as copper and jade. Mixed vocabularies show up where pastures met field edges, a hint of long-standing bilingual zones around river mouths and mountain gates. The story opens in a garden with a legend. Empress Lei Zhu, also known as Ji Lingxi, sits with tea when a white cocoon tumbles in and looses into a filament so fine it can wrap a finger many times. The tale survives because it matches what early sericulturalists learned. Heat and moisture soften the binding of the cocoon, and careful hands can tease out a single continuous thread hundreds of meters long. That discovery anchors China's first great household industry, one that mixes kitchen tools, orchard care, and steady labor into an unbroken line from worm to robe. From there, secrecy turns a craft into policy. For centuries, the methods of sericulture, how to rear the worms, harvest the cocoons, and twist the raw filament into strong thread, were treated as state property. Smuggling eggs or mulberry cuttings out of the realm could mean penalties as severe as death. The point was simple: control the inputs and you control the market. Court edicts restricted who could raise silkworms, who could wear the best grades, and who could handle the most refined cloth. Knowledge moved inside families and guilds, sealed by oath and custom. The work began along the Yellow River, where farmers balanced grain fields with rows of mulberry trees. Mulberry leaves are the only food of the domesticated silkworm accepts, so timing mattered. Households staggered egg hatching to match the spring flush of leaves, then fed the larvae several times a day, keeping rooms clean and at even temperatures. After a brief, intense feeding cycle, the worms spun cocoons. Workers sorted them by quality, steamed them to stop the moth from cutting the filament, and then soaked and reeled them into raw silk that could be twisted, dyed, and woven. Silk meant more than clothing. In early courts, it carried meanings of purity, power, and the hope of a long life. Fine bolts dressed rites for ancestors. Banners and sashes marked rank. Burial garments wrapped the body with the promise of status beyond death. The fiber's strength and luster fed those ideas. It took brilliant dye, resisted rot better than linen, and packed a shine that torchlight turned into a soft glow. Technically, the craft pushed tools forward. Weighted looms, petals, and complex patterning allowed tight, even weaves and figured cloth long before similar setups appeared farther west. Specialist weavers and workshops standardized widths and thread counts. Dyers learned to fix color with mineral mordants. Inspectors measured bolts and stamped them with marks of quality, tying workmanship to reputation and price. That robe also counted as money. States paid troops and officials in silk, graded by length and fineness. Villages remitted part of their tax as bolts. Diplomatic gifts included rare patterned pieces and floss for foreign courts to study, yet not easily copy. The fabric moved ideas of hierarchy and good faith across borders while keeping the core process at home. That early thread hints at thin but real connections running west long before caravans took shape. And ancient observers who saw the finest gauzes thought the fabric grew on trees, an error that shows how extraordinary top-grade Chinese work looked to those without the craft. After centuries of fractured kingdoms, The Han Dynasty consolidated power in 206 BCE and turned internal order into external reach. Stable tax revenues, standardized laws, and a professional army allowed planners to think beyond river valleys. Grain moved along canals to frontier garrisons. Workshops produced weapons and uniforms at scale. With the center holding, imperial focus shifted to the steppe corridors, where raids cut into revenue and prestige. Stability did not quiet the borders. It made the court confident enough to push them outward. At the heart of that push stood Emperor Wu of Han. He backed long campaigns, funded new colonies at choke points, and treated the frontier like a ledger. Invest in posts and patrols, and the returns would arrive as quiet borders, tribute, and access to coveted horses. He ordered surveys of passes, stockpiling fodder and water at intervals. He issued ranks and rewards to officers who took and held ground along the Hexi corridor, the narrow land bridge leading from the Yellow River to the oases of the Tarim Basin. Enter Zhang Qian, a court official dispatched around 138 BCE with a simple brief: find allies in the west against the Xiongnu. Captured soon after departure, he spent years in forced residence among the people he was meant to outflank, then escaped and continued west. What he found shocked the court when he finally returned. Beyond those deserts and mountains lay settled kingdoms, farms, and markets trading goods that China had scarcely cataloged. The world did not end at the steppe. It curved into Central Asia and down toward Bactria and Persia. His reports mapped an opportunity. In places like Dayuan in Fergana, he saw strong horses and vineyards. In Bactria, he noted crafts and contacts with Iranian lands. He learned that merchants already moved between these regions along established trails, passing glassware, gold, and fine breeds. By the time he reached China again, older and scarred, he carried itineraries as valuable as treaties. Even without a formal pact, his information stitched the Han into a Western web of exchanges. The obstacle remained the Xiongnu, who controlled key corridors and could choke movement at will. Han's strategy answered with layered defenses, beacon towers to relay warnings, walled colonies to anchor supply, and mobile columns to escort envoys and merchants. Fortified way stations dotted the Hexi, turning a once perilous run into scheduled stages. The army drilled in desert marches and cold weather logistics. Officials brokered safe passage with local tribes where force had limits. With security came trade. Silk, jade, and lacquerware left the frontier markets, and in return came horses bred for endurance, worked glass, coins, and even grape cuttings that reshaped diets and winemaking in China. The exchange did not run on a single highway. It moved across a web of trails that bent around dunes, skirted mountains, and threaded oases like Dunhuang, Kucha, and Kashgar. Fees shifted with seasons. Guides changed with languages. Yet the volume grew because the state reduced the worst risks. Zhang Qian's endurance under captivity, over 13 years, gave his account unusual depth, and that depth altered policy. Court budgets now included funds for Western embassies and horse purchases. The heavenly horses of Fergana, rumored to sweat blood from a parasite, obsessed the throne and drew armies toward the valleys that bred them. Maps in the palace expanded west as dusty caravans and armored riders pushed milestones farther from the capital. With Emperor Wu's ambition and Zhang Qian's courage, China's silk left the realm of legend and began its journey toward Rome. The Persian plateau spreads like a stone bridge between mountains and seas, forcing every east-west caravan to step onto its surface. From the Zagros in the west to the Kopet Dag and Pamirs in the east, passes, salt flats, and river corridors funnel traffic through narrow gates. Whoever commands those gates shapes the terms of exchange. Forts overlook wadis. Watchtowers signal dust trails long before hooves arrive. For merchants, the price of moving goods includes not only animals and fodder, but fees set at each bottleneck. Into this landscape rise the Parthians, heirs to Achaemenid routes and records, and the first to turn this middle ground into a business model. Their kings position garrisons at oasis thresholds, register caravans, and levy duties on each load. They do not need looms or vineyards to profit, they need choke points and reliable escorts. Customs houses tally bales, scribes log origins and destinations. By stabilizing crossings and punishing freelance toll collectors, they make the plateau predictable, which raises throughput and tax revenues. Parthian policy also protects the markups. Roman shippers and Chinese producers seldom meet face-to-face because intermediaries seal the chain in segments. A dealer in Mesopotamia buys silk in bulk from an Eastern broker, repacks it, and sells to a Western agent who never learns the original price. The same happens in reverse with glassware and metalware. Distances and languages help, but design is the key. Separation preserves margins. A merchant's knowledge becomes an asset, guarded as tightly as a treasure chest. These caravanserais provide water, stables, repair yards, and rooms where scribes exchange currencies and validate weights. Parthian soldiers ride perimeter patrols, their bow cases slung high. The famed Parthian shot, turning in the saddle to fire while retreating, keeps raiders cautious and frustrates heavy infantry. Cavalry doctrine becomes economics by other means. Safe corridors tempt bigger consignments and repeat traffic. Luxury flows define the pattern. Silk heads west in tightly packed bales, joined by lacquer and fine jade. Eastbound, Roman glassware travels wrapped in straw, along with worked gold, silver, coins by the sack, and amphora-borne wine that changes taste after weeks on the move. Each good has a preferred route and season. Heat can cloud glass. Cold snaps kill pack animals. Schedules adapt, and fees adjust when risk rises. Brokers quote different rates for winter passes and spring floods. By the 3rd century, the Sassanian dynasty takes the baton and professionalizes the network further. State workshops standardize measures. Toll stations publish rates. Cities like Ctesiphon and Nishapur glow at night with markets that run till dawn, pulling in weavers, metalworkers, scribes, and physicians. Zoroastrian fire temples stand near bazaars, their ritual fires marking civic time and royal authority. Administrative habits, sealed documents, layered audits, provincial governors with precise quotas, influence neighbors who adopt similar paperwork to court Persian trade. Persian art stamps the goods moving through. Stucco reliefs, vine scrolls, and hunting scenes migrate onto textiles and metal plates bound for distant courts. Motifs travel as quietly as ledgers, and on Rome's side, demand for silk climbs so high that aristocratic wardrobes threaten household finances, prompting moral campaigns against imported finery. The cultural exchange is lopsided in price, but rich in taste. Buyers reshape styles while sellers refine supply. At Rome's height, the empire's highways funneled grain, taxes, and troops toward a center that wanted one more thing: luxuries from the far side of Persia. Senators sat in marble halls under roofs supported by imported timber, debating budgets while their households ordered spices, stones, and a new status fabric whose origin story no one in the forum could confirm. Demand ran ahead of knowledge. The city learned the names of ports faster than it learned the source of its favorite cloth. Silk caught the eye first. Draped over the shoulders, it broke light across folds in a way wool and linen never did. Tailors cut it thin for summer and layered it under cloaks in winter. Most Romans had no idea it came from worms farmed on mulberry leaves. They only knew it cost silver, lots of it, and that wearing it announced access to merchants who could source the finest grades. Auctions moved bales alongside jewelry and perfumes, and estate inventories began listing silk by weight and weave. The route to acquire it bent and forked through hands that never met. Persian, Indian, and Central Asian traders acted as links in a chain, each adding a markup that paid for escorts, storage, and risk. A bale might start in Chang'an's markets, change currencies in oasis towns, pass through caravan taxes on the plateau, then ship from a Gulf port to Red Sea docks before a short haul into Alexandria and on to Rome. A single thread on a map could not capture the swaps in languages, measures, and coins that happened in transit. Think of that thread morphing as it moves. Chinese characters on the first receipt, Aramaic, Greek, and Latin scribbles on later notes, seals pressed in clay, then wax. Cities like Palmyra and Petra grew rich by sitting in the middle of that sequence. Their warehouses shaded goods, while deals closed in courtyards where brokers quoted rates in multiple tongues. Caravans timed arrivals to market days that matched the next ship's departure. Rome did not only import. Its glassmakers sent translucent cups east, packed in straw-lined crates that reduced breakage over long rides. Wine in amphorae, olive oil in coated jars, and metalwork with crisp reliefs found buyers who valued novel materials and techniques. The flow of exports paid for the inflow of textiles and spices, and it also carried styles. A carved vine scroll on a Roman platter could inspire a motif on a belt clasp thousands of kilometers away. Officers and entrepreneurs tried to reach the source. Expeditions left the Red Sea, followed monsoon winds, and sought a route to Serica by water. They did not establish a direct, regular link, but they left traces in coastal markets across the Indian Ocean. Roman coins have turned up as far as Vietnam, small proofs of sailors and middlemen testing paths along the rim of monsoon Asia. Ideas followed the cargo. Greco-Roman columns, acanthus leaves, and haloed figures appeared in Central Asian Buddhist sites, blended into local stone and plaster. In return, tales of distant courts filtered back, along with new pigments and workshop tricks. Chinese writers recorded a Western realm they called Daxin, a nod that both ends of the chain sensed each other across the relay. Silk stirred debate at home, too. Some playwrights mocked dresses for showing more than they covered, turning fabric into a moral theme in crowded theaters. Yet the plays did not slow the purchases. As Rome's roads met Asia's horizons, the Silk Road became not just a route of trade, but a bridge of worlds. By this century, the Silk Road breathes like a living system. Routes split and rejoin, some hugging rivers, others threading dunes between low hills and salt pans. Footsteps stack into paths, and paths into corridors that can carry a season's worth of goods. Merchants, pilgrims, envoys, and hired guards step into the same distances with different hopes. A caravan master studies sky haze for wind, counts water skins twice, and names stages not by miles, but by wells. The caravan defines the rhythm. Bactrian camels move in files of 30 or 50, their padded feet pressing prints that hold shape until the next wind. Each animal hauls a load balanced in woven panniers, folded silk bolts strapped tight against chafe, spice sacks sealed with wax cord, small chests of coins wrapped in felt. A bell hangs from a lead camel to keep cadence, and drivers sing short calls to steady pacing on soft ground. Donkeys and mules work the rougher banks. Horses scout passes, then fall back to guard the flanks. The camel counts as a tool as much as a beast. 2 humps store fat for lean stretches. A split upper lip pulls thorny shrubs without bleeding. Nostrils pinch against dust. A shaggy winter coat sheds when the air warms. With these adaptations, a train can link the Pamir Highlands to the Persian plateau across weeks of cold nights and noon glare. Schedules align with seasons. Spring melt opens passes. Late summer lowers rivers for easier fords. Autumn winds cool the desert and stretch daily range. Caravanserais rise at the day's edge. Thick walls keep heat out and thieves out. One gate opens to a courtyard ringed by stables, storerooms, and raised sleeping platforms. A well sits under a roof, its rope smooth from years of hands. Keepers sell barley, fodder cakes, lamp oil, and salt. Scribes weigh bales, compare stamped seals, and record debts in neat columns. A blacksmith earns a steady wage resetting shoe nails and mending buckles bent by a bad step. Night narrows the world to lamp circles. The air holds sweat, wood smoke, and cumin from stew pots. Tongues mix without ceremony, Greek for a unit of weight, Sanskrit for a spice grade, Sogdian for a credit note, Chinese for a silk pattern. A young clerk learns that a hand sign for 5 in one town means 10 in another, and that a nod can close a sale faster than a contract when camels are already kneeling. Every leg risks loss. Sandstorms roll in like curtains and erase the trail. Bandits watch from gravel ridges, counting guards before choosing a shadowed bend. Mirage pools bend sight and tempt tired drivers offline. Traders answer with spacing rules, dawn departures, and decoys. Cheap bales tied with heavy rope to slow a thief. Veterans wrap their feet in layered cloth against blisters and frostbite, and they carry a spare awl because leather always fails at the worst time. Still, profits and reach justify the hazard. Bolts of Chinese fabric end up in distant villas. Mediterranean glass rides east in straw and shows up unbroken in tombs far from the sea. Archaeologists have uncovered Roman glassware in Han-era burials, proof that even a jar shard can travel farther than an army. The Silk Road keeps time not with milestones, but with hoofbeats, the steady measure of caravans turning distance into livelihood. The road carried more than cargo. It carried prayers, songs, and rules for living. Monks, priests, and teachers walked the same paths as spice sellers, and their audiences were the same inn courtyards and shaded bazaar corners. Travelers swapped recipes for ink and for stew, but also steps for rituals and the right phrases to greet a shrine. Belief became portable, packed in memory and copied onto palm leaves and silk, then handed to the next guide who knew the wells. From northern India, Buddhist monks learned the timing of passes and the cost of fodder. They left monasteries along the Ganges plain with manuscripts wrapped in cloth and a few relics sealed in small reliquaries. In Khotan, they gained patrons among local rulers who funded new halls and libraries. At Dunhuang, cave walls turned into long murals where painters set entire sutra scenes into bands that a pilgrim could read by lamplight. Turfan added copy rooms where scribes trained to match scripts line by line, preserving texts even when caravans missed a season. Each stop adapted the faith to local habits. Donors asked for images that looked like neighbors they respected, so a Buddha took on fuller faces and heavier robes suited to colder climates. Monastic rules softened to fit caravan life, allowing travel for alms and protection of books. Debate halls hosted discussions in multiple languages, and translators forged shared terms for ideas like compassion and emptiness so that students from different towns could follow the same lesson. Across the Iranian plateau, Zoroastrian fire temples kept ritual time for cities and traders. Their priests maintained sacred flames and taught rules about purity that mapped well onto desert hygiene and market fairness. That same landscape also launched Mani's followers, who shaped a message meant to harmonize wisdoms and sent missionaries who learned local scripts quickly so they could write hymns and homilies for fresh audiences. Their communities appeared along major junctions, lived on patronage from merchants, and recorded travel routes alongside teachings. Christianity arrived by quiet steps rather than imperial orders. Communities we call Nestorian set up in caravan towns and learned to preach in Aramaic and local dialects. They met steppe leaders in tent courts and later reached Chinese officials open to foreign doctrine as a sign of cosmopolitan rule. In time, carved stones in the Far East carried crosses and inscriptions that stitched together local dates with a wider sacred calendar. Religious art began to borrow across boundaries. Angels gained wings shaped like those on Central Asian riders. Bodhisattvas wore crowns that resembled local kingly headgear. Halos moved between traditions and shifted size and meaning. Techniques moved too. Plaster recipes for cave walls, pigments carried in small packets, and patterns for brocade that let temples commission fabrics suited to new rites. On these roads, conversion rarely ran in straight lines. Shrines sat side by side, and families might sponsor a cave painting, a fire temple repair, and a roadside cross in the same decade. Belief became a shared echo, familiar enough to welcome, new enough to matter. In the sands of Western China, fragments of Buddhist scriptures survive with telltale materials, Sanskrit lines laid down using Persian ink and Chinese brushes. Each stroke records a collaboration, proof that faith traveled the same way as trade, by passing through many hands with care and intent, then setting out again toward the next oasis. The Silk Road looks tidy on a map, but on the ground it's scattered into bright clusters where routes paused and recombined. Those clusters were cities, waypoints that stored grain and stories, repaired gear, reset debts, and sent news sprinting to the next gate. Between deserts and mountain walls, these places held enough water and trust to make long-distance exchange possible. They stitched moving parts into something that felt stable, even if only for a season. Samarkand, Merv, Bukhara, Dunhuang, Kashgar, names carried forward because they solved the same problem in different landscapes: how to welcome strangers quickly and profitably. City gates framed markets layered by specialty. One lane handled textiles and dyes, another weights and metals, another fodder and animals. Guilds kept reputations clean. A bad scale brought fines. Inns sorted travelers by cargo and language to speed bargaining. Courtyards doubled as message boards where scribes posted rates for fodder, camel hire, and safe passage escorts. Merchants rarely saw the finish line. A broker moved silk only to the next river. Another handled the climb to an oasis. Another arranged credit for the last stretch to a seaport. Chinese silk, Persian silver, Indian ivory, Roman glass. Each handoff added a small fee and a receipt in another script. In one morning, a bale might gain 3 seals and a new wrapper, then leave in a different caravan under the same destination note. No single ledger captured the whole arc, but in these streets, the pieces lined up long enough to keep goods flowing. Walls and houses displayed what moved. Sogdian painters set banquet scenes and hunting rides into lime plaster, lively with patterned garments and curved drinking horns. Tamarisk shade cooled staging yards where camels knelt while drivers rinsed dust from mouths with salted tea. The air ran on copper tang from metalwork, sweat from animals, and cardamom steaming from pots. In Merv, an astronomer checked star lists to set prayer hours and caravan departures. In Dunhuang, a table held 4 scripts at once while copyists matched strokes to preserve a donor's text before a caravan left. Trade taught translation faster than schools. A clerk learned that a coin's face could change while its silver stayed constant, that a number meant weight here and count there. Buyers paid by local measure, sellers recorded by their own, and brokers reconciled the gap for a small cut. Tracks traveled with portable seals and witness marks. Failure meant public shame and blocked access to the city's best stalls, penalty worse than a fine. These cities floated on a narrow margin. A river shifted or a governor raised tolls, and caravans took another pass. Wealth could peel away in a single season, leaving mud brick walls to slump back into the earth. Yet for centuries, the constellation held, bright enough to orient strangers. In the sand-choked ruins of Nia on the edge of the Taklamakan, a small wooden tablet surfaced, a legal notice written in Gandhari and sealed with a Greek-style stamp. One object tied India's language habits to Hellenistic administration and a Chinese frontier court. That blend captures the experiment these cities ran long before anyone used the word globalization. Connect people who would never meet, make trust legible, and turn distance into a routine. By the early 600s, the trade web reached a steady pulse, and the Tang state stepped into it with confidence. Administrators reopened corridors through the Hexi, set garrisons where oases could fail, and tied inland routes to river and canal freight so shipments hit markets on schedule. Revenue from land taxes and monopolies on salt and tea funded embassies and road repairs. The result was reach. Envoys moved under escort, brokers secured guides in frontier towns, and long-distance caravans found predictable stages across the northwest. Chang'an made that reach visible. The city stretched in a planned grid with avenues wide enough for troops and processions, and 2 giant markets that divided stalls by origin, language, and craft. Morning drums opened trade. Evening drums closed the gates. Inside the walls, Persians bargained over aromatics. Sogdians ran taverns and stables. Arab and Central Asian merchants handled textiles and horses. Koreans and Japanese brought lacquer and rare woods. And Indian monks copied texts in temple quarters. Zoroastrian shrines stood near Buddhist cloisters and Taoist halls. A foreign guest could find familiar bread, a translator, and a money changer within a few blocks. The court leaned into this mix. Imperial studs raised imported Arabian lines to improve cavalry mounts. Stable records tracked bloodlines like assets, pairing steppe endurance with desert speed. Envoys carried patterned silks and lacquer to Constantinople and Damascus and returned with metalwork, glass, and detailed notes on court protocol. Monks and scholars arrived with relics, maps, and grammatical lists. They left with land grants for temples and crates of sutras from palace libraries. Diplomatic audiences turned into exchange fairs where instruments, dyes, and pigments changed hands alongside letters. Art and taste followed the traffic. Workshops in the capital painted foreign dancers with billowing sleeves, modeled steppe horses with high necks and clipped manes, and gave merchants from Samarkand deep-set eyes and curly beards. Potters mixed new glazes after studying imported wares. Weavers set vine scrolls and pearl roundels into fabrics that traveled back west with a Tang twist. Musicians folded Persian lutes and rhythms into court ensembles, and banquet lists added dates, pistachios, and grape wine into native staples. The visual language of the age fused techniques and subjects until a viewer could read movement across the empire at a glance. This openness relied on force and negotiation at the edges. Campaigns against steppe coalitions secured the Gansu corridor. Treaties with oasis kings kept wells open, and tax stations audited loads to keep revenue steady. Yet the system held only while the center balanced expense, loyalty, and grain. Frontier wars strained budgets, and rival factions at court gambled with commanders who controlled entire regions. When the An Lushan rebellion burst from the northeast, armies marched through the heartland, capitals fell and were retaken, and the routes faltered. Caravans waited for guarantees that did not come. Garrisons consumed grain that once fed trade. Foreign quarters in Chang'an grew quieter as patrons vanished. Even so, the record of that wide horizon survives in the ground. Tang tombs near Xi'an yield clay figures of foreign traders with sharply carved noses, curled beards, knit caps, and layered coats, a catalog of faces that pass through the markets. These images, set beside pack animals and entertainers, show a court that looked outward and knew its intermediaries by type and trade. For a time, the Tang state did not just buy from the world. It operated as a hub where language, finance, and taste converged. And from there, the story turns west and south, where new powers begin to anchor sea lanes along the land roads. When Muhammad's message took root in Western Arabia, two giants on its borders were already stumbling. Byzantium had spent decades trading blows with Persia, and Sassanian authority frayed under the cost. Into that gap, the first caliphates organized belief and rule into a system that could travel. Armies secured corridors from the Levant to the Oxus, tax registers standardized dues, and judges applied a shared legal vocabulary across markets that had long bargained in many tongues. The map redrew quickly. Within a century, Arabic names labeled coasts on the Atlantic and the banks of the Indus. That speed mattered for trade. Caravans did not stop. They found new guarantees. The early governors kept wadis policed, repaired wells, and posted rates at toll points. With risk contained, merchants scaled up. Arabic became the contract language that linked Berber guides, Persian brokers, and Turkic camel masters. Friday markets set a weekly pulse that synced buying and shipping windows from North Africa to Transoxiana. The road network stayed the same in shape, but the rules along it gained uniformity that cut transaction costs. Under the Abbasids, a capital at Baghdad tied river routes on the Tigris and Euphrates to desert lines heading for Syria and Khorasan. The city's plan favored circulation, keys for bulk goods, specialized souks for textiles, perfumes, books, and metal. Paper mills worked near copyists, and copyists worked near booksellers. Translation houses gathered Greek treatises, Indian mathematics, and Persian statecraft, then rendered them in Arabic so a student in Basra could read what a doctor studied in Jundishapur. Knowledge learned to ship. Caravans now carried more than fabrics and spice. Bales shared space with paper reams, astrolabes, and annotated tables of star positions. Algebra moved in compiled texts, compact enough to pack with ledgers. Physicians traveled to courts with jars of compounds and case notes. They returned with stipends and students. Surveyors left with improved sighting instruments, then used them to set Qibla directions from new mosques. The scholar and the merchant often bought the same tickets and hired the same guards. Cities east of the Iranian plateau rose in this rhythm. In Samarkand, Waqf endowments funded schools beside Caravanserais, so a copyist could bind a Quran leaf in the morning and a star chart in the afternoon. In Merv, timekeepers sounded prayer hours that also cued market openings. Judges arbitrated partnership contracts, kirat arrangements that let an investor back a merchant's journey for a share of profit, reducing risk for long runs to the Oxus or the Gulf. Writing grew practical. Short, clear forms replaced ornate contracts, so a clerk in Nishapur and one in Kufa could reconcile accounts in a glance. The road kept its old neutrality. Sogdian, Persian, and Arab houses shared stalls and co-signed letters of credit. A caravan might halt for dusk prayers and, an hour later, resume haggling over pepper grades and porcelain weight. Some routes quieted during campaigns. Others drew traffic when governors reopened desert forts. The desert still dictated pace, and the monsoon still set sailing dates, but the bureaucracy linked those cycles into a dependable calendar for trade. Archaeologists working in early Abbasid layers at Baghdad have found Tang porcelain shards, early pieces outside East Asia, evidence that Gulf sailors and overland brokers already moved goods across half the planet. In practice, the Silk Road under Islam became the artery of a wider world. Belief, craft, and science rode together, tagged in seals in Arabic script, then passed on to the next gate where the same rules made a foreign deal feel routine. Long before ships stitched oceans together or wires carried messages, the Silk Road moved know-how in small, durable packets. A recipe for ink, a weaving count, a way to temper steel. Ideas traveled as favors owed to a teacher, as marginal notes on a devotional text, as a craftsman's habit taught to an apprentice who paid in meals and trust. The network behaved like an early internet, not of signals but of skills, copying itself person by person across long distances. Paper is the clearest case. Chinese workshops turned plant fiber into sheets by beating pulp, lifting it on screens, and pressing the water away. After 751 CE, when Muslim forces seized Chinese artisans near Talas, that workflow shifted west. Within a generation, mills in Samarkand and then Baghdad adapted linen rags to the same method. The result flooded markets with cheaper writing surfaces. Scribes multiplied texts, accountants kept parallel books, and scholars assembled libraries that indexed medicine, law, geometry, and ethics in one reachable place for the next reader. Other Chinese crafts began their slow westward march. Gunpowder started as an alchemist byproduct. Saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal combined while seeking longevity formulas. Yet its spark drew experimenters into fireworks, signals, and later, weapons. The magnetic compass, first a curiosity balancing a pointer towards south, became a planning tool for travelers who needed bearings when landmarks failed. Woodblock printing let monasteries and bureaus reproduce sutras, calendars, and official forms with consistent lines and spacing. Each step multiplied what one skilled hand could share. South Asia contributed the number toolkit that made large-scale accounting possible. Place value numerals and a clear symbol for zero compressed big quantities into short strings, easy to add, subtract, and scale. Astronomers used them to model planetary cycles. Merchants used them to split profit shares and compute caravan wages. Persia supplied precision hardware and glass. Astrolabes, plain spheric models cut and engraved in metal, translated the sky into angles for navigation, timekeeping, and direction. Glassmakers refined colors and clarity, passing furnace temperatures, flux recipes, and annealing schedules along a chain of shops. Arabic writing scholars gathered and tested this flow. In Bukhara and Baghdad, a reader could consult a Greek geometry proof amended by an Indian algorithm and explained with Persian terminology. Algebra grew from practical problems, inheritance, partnership, surveying, into a general language that treated unknowns as things to isolate and solve. Alchemy, often framed as transformation of matter, delivered laboratory routines, filtration, distillation, and careful measurement. Astronomy linked tables, instruments, and observation sites into a shared standard for calendars and prayer times. People moved the current. Merchants carried sample kits, dyes, metal filings, paper swatches, so buyers could verify quality. Monks packed portable libraries, copying a text in one town, correcting it in the next, and adding a gloss in the third. Pilgrims compared shrine rituals and carried back small devices, from water clocks to surgical needles. Caravanserais nights functioned as peer review. A glassworker quizzed a scribe about ink permanence. Navigator tested a compass beside an astrolabe under a clear sky. One innovation quietly set the tempo. In Buddhist monasteries of 8th century China, makers likely devised a mechanical escapement, a device that regulates a clock's tick in controlled pulses. That trick, centuries before Europe's tower clocks, turned flowing time into countable even steps. By the year 1000, the Silk Road had become the machine of memory, storing procedures and tools, scripts, and trained hands, then forwarding them to the next horizon where a student waited beside a vat, a forge, or a table of stars. While caravans still moved across deserts, a second network gathered strength along the coasts. By the 9th century, the Maritime Silk Road tied China, Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa into one monsoon-driven circuit. Seasonal winds set the schedule. Traders prepared hulls and cargoes during the lull, then rode steady breezes across long reaches, using predictable landfalls to rest, repair, and reprovision. Ports that once handled local exchange scaled up into ocean hubs with custom sheds, lighthouse fires, and multilingual brokers who could price pepper and porcelain without opening a ledger. Chinese ports led the outward push. From Guangzhou to Quanzhou, sturdy junks sailed with bulk cargo packed tight in compartmented hulls fastened by iron nails and wooden dowels. Crews followed pilot books that listed reefs, currents, and star bearings. The calendar split into two halves: westward runs on one monsoon, homeward on the return. Across the water, Calicut, Malacca, and Aden evolved into sea-based caravanserais. Warehouses stacked silk, celadon, sandalwood, spices, pearls, and aromatic resins. Money changers handled cash and cowries, silver, and gold. Translators matched merchants with local officials who stamped contracts and weighed duties. The ocean altered scale and speed. A single ship could move what dozens of camels hauled, and do it in weeks rather than months. That efficiency rewarded states that controlled choke points. Srivijaya, seated on Sumatra near the Malacca Strait, taxed passage and sheltered fleets waiting on winds. The Chola of southern India built blue water squadrons that escorted convoys and struck rival ports. Arab merchants from Oman to Yemen threaded routes up the Red Sea and around the Gulf, linking inland caravans with sea lanes. On deck, the working languages mixed: Mandarin for cargo lists, Tamil for contracts in Malabar, Arabic for navigation, and Swahili for deals along the East African coast. Exchange reached into daily life. Chinese ceramics turned up in East African burials and household middens. Indian pepper and cardamom flavored Persian stews. Yemeni incense perfumed temples from the Deccan to the delta towns of southern China. Pilots taught the lateen sail and the use of the astrolabe, adding tools that tightened routes and reduced guesswork. Shipwrights compared hull techniques, borrowing watertight bulkheads from one tradition and caulking mixes from another. Even diets adjusted on board. Rice, dates, dried fish, and pickled greens stocked galleys according to crew mix and voyage length. The sea took as much as it gave. Storm belts erased fleets in a night. Bars shifted at harbor mouths and stranded ships within sight of warehouses. Pirates learned monsoon timing, striking when holds were full and crews were tired. Port politics could flip with a succession dispute or a tax rise, pushing traffic to a rival anchorage a day's sail away. Still, for roughly 6 centuries, the Indian Ocean formed the world's busiest marketplace, its winds and currents serving as the timetable for long-distance trade before any ocean-crossing empire appeared in Europe. Proof sits on a seabed. In 1998, divers off Indonesia found the Belitung shipwreck, an Arab dhow loaded with more than 60,000 Tang-era Chinese ceramics, preserved beneath sand for around 11 centuries. One vessel's cargo showed the scale of exchange, the trust in repeat wins, and the reach of buyers waiting across the water. By the 14th century, the Silk Road had 2 fronts: the old tracks across dust and the routes traced in foam and salt, open to any master who could read the sky. In 1206, Temujin took the name Genghis Khan and turned clan warfare into an engine of expansion. Within a generation, Mongol forces struck in multiple theaters at once: Khitans and Jurchens in the east, Khwarezmian domains in the west, using disciplined cavalry, relay intelligence, and siege crews recruited from conquered artisans. Towns that resisted faced annihilation. Those that yielded were registered, taxed, and left to function under new supervisors. The violence was real, but it created corridors of predictable control across lands that had long been contested. That predictability reshaped trade. The Mongol Empire covered the spine of Eurasia more completely than any state before it, and the Silk Road ran with fewer interruptions. The Yam, relay stations spaced a day's ride apart, supplied fresh horses, food, and shelter to authorized travelers. Couriers carried official packets with sealed orders, but merchants also bought access, moving under escort across stretches once notorious for raids. Weight standards and tolls became legible from North China to the Oxus. For a trader, it meant fewer bribes, faster stages, and contracts that could assume delivery within a season. Movement scaled up fast. Caravans carried silk, raw and woven, alongside ingots of silver, bales of fur, sugar, pepper, and slaves from steppe frontiers and captured cities. Maps and portolan notes circulated between agents in different khanates. The relay's speed tightened decision cycles. A buyer in Tabriz could learn about a glut in yuan markets before committing to a shipment. Paper money issued in the East reached Central Asian depots, with brokers discounting notes based on distance and trust in local officials. Scholars and artisans moved too. Persian astronomers worked in Chinese observatories that recorded eclipses and star positions with new instruments. Italian families opened counting houses in key hubs, learning to settle accounts with letters of credit rather than hauling coin. Administration recruited talent wherever it found it. Engineers from the Islamic world supervised river diversions, siege engines. Chinese physicians brought formularies and pulse methods into court medicine. European metalworkers taught casting and minting tricks useful for coinage and bells. Scribes trained in Uyghur script handled multilingual paperwork that allowed decrees to roll out across newly annexed territories. The empire pooled techniques and personnel, not as a cultural project, but as a way to keep supply, taxation, and war running on schedule. The same channels carried risk. Caravan traffic and postal riders moved not only fabrics and texts, but pathogens. Rodent fleas thriving on grain stores and pack animals spread a plague that leapt from steppe zones to oasis towns, Black Sea ports, and Mediterranean cities. As the disease advanced, nodes slowed or failed, and the network that had enabled rapid exchange amplified crisis. Even so, the logistics remained impressive. Mongol envoys traveled with a paisa, a stamped metal tablet that ordered officials to provide mounts, lodging, and provisions. With that credential, an embassy could ride from the Pacific Rim to the Mediterranean, passing through guard posts that recognized a common authority. For a brief period, rates, measures, and procedures aligned across distances that had once required a dozen different agreements. The Mongol peace rested on force, but it delivered reach. Trade houses planned shipments in weeks, not seasons. Ports compared calendars, and star tables compiled on opposite sides of the continent. Under this umbrella, the Silk Road felt like a single system, even as the edges frayed and a new disruption gathered in the West. By the late 1200s, The road stretched farther than any European map could hold, and a teenage Venetian stepped onto it with his father and uncle. Marco Polo left a lagoon city of merchants and shipyards and headed for a court that few in Europe believed existed as described. Their mission was trade, but the journey became a record of a world working at a continental scale under Mongol rule. The trio moved with caravan rhythms and official passes, finding local guides where the route demanded new skills, and learning to treat distance as a sequence of negotiated corridors. They crossed Persia's market towns and toll gates, then into Bactria's irrigated valleys where Greek place names still lingered from older conquests. The Pamir highlands forced slow marches along ledges where altitude thinned speech and breath. Beyond lay the Gobi, a spread of gravel plains and cold nights where oases functioned like hinges in a massive door. Each stop had rules, weights, measures, and taxes that tried to make movement predictable, even when weather and war did not. The farther they went, the more the network looked less like a line and more like a set of options, each chosen for season and security. Khanbalik, the Mongol capital in North China, answered questions Europe had not thought to ask. Streets were paved and set on a grid. Way stations moved officials and goods with a timetable. Paper currency linked markets without the drag of metal. And coal heated homes and bathhouses with a steady burn. Administrative offices kept registers, seals, and archives that turned population into numbers that could be taxed and fed. The court managed multilingual audiences with interpreters and formal protocols. This was governance as infrastructure. Polo stayed long enough to see systems in detail. He noted porcelain production in kilns that relied on consistent temperature control and specialized clays, with workshops dividing labor into grinding, shaping, glazing, and firing. He traveled through salt districts, where brine, wells, and state monopolies produced revenue that paid soldiers and road guards. He watched canal traffic carry grain along set quotas to cities that counted inhabitants in the hundreds of thousands. In one region, he learned how courier stations could shift orders across provinces faster than armies could march. In another, he encountered frontier officials balancing steppe alliances with agricultural demands. When he returned to Venice and dictated what he had seen, listeners heard claims that clashed with their assumptions. Black stones that burned sounded like fable to a Mediterranean used to wood and charcoal. Paper money seemed like a trick that ought to fail. Bureaucracy running distant provinces by written instruction felt alien to feudal habits. Yet merchants copied his notes. Navigators marked ports and distances, and mapmakers added cities that had never appeared in European charts. Over time, the book reframed Asia for readers who would never go. It offered prices, measures, and road times, described foods, rituals, and legal customs, and suggested that wealth could flow by design rather than luck. Later travelers carried it as a manual as much as a marvel. One sailor in the Atlantic age took it as a guide to far ports that might lie across the water rather than across the land. Early printers saw the demand. Among the first texts pressed in movable type were versions of his journey, spreading a shared reference for places and practices beyond Christendom's borders. Polo did not discover anything the people he met did not already know. He made it legible to an audience that had forgotten how big the world could be and how many systems had been running without them. In the mid-1300s, the exchange moved faster than diagnoses. Traders still counted loads and ledgers, but a second ledger ran under their feet, written by fleas and hosts they never saw. The reservoirs likely lay in burrows along the Tian Shan, where rodent populations cycle with grass and weather. When food surged, so did colonies. When droughts pushed animals toward camps and granaries, the barrier between wild and human broke. A flea that fed on an infected marmot or gerbil could transfer aboard a pack animal, nest in a saddle blanket, or ride in a sack of grain. One bite created a chain, and the chain found tracks already cleared by empire. From Central Asian oases, pests moved as efficiently as customs duties. Caravans took on water, fodder, and new companions. They also swapped vermin. Way stations with shared bedding compressed the distance between strangers. By 1346, the contagion reached Kaffa on the Crimean coast, a crowded port where Genoese factors bought steppe goods and hired crews for Mediterranean runs. Ships carried rats better than camels ever could. Within a year, the infection crossed to islands and peninsulas, following wind and current as reliably as any chart. Between 1347 and the mid-1350s, mortality spiked across towns and countryside. Parish registers thinned, fields went fallow, workshops closed for lack of hands. Commerce depends on confidence more than coin. As rumors of swellings and sudden deaths spread, markets lost their rhythm. City gates watched the road for strangers and dust. Quarantines and cordons tried to slow what nobody could see, while toll houses stood empty because travelers turned back. Insurance rates rose where such instruments existed. Elsewhere, merchants chose storage over motion and hoped stores would outlast the danger. The Silk Road's strength, its regularity, became a liability. Predictable intervals meant predictable leaps for vectors. The political shocks matched the biological ones. In China, years of famine and tax strain had already weakened the yuan. Revolts in the countryside multiplied, grain shipments faltered, and the court's ability to fund garrisons and patrols waned. In many Islamic lands, where long-distance merchants had knitted together cities from Tabriz to Damascus, caravans shrank and some routes fell silent. Khans, emirs, and city councils still issued orders, but fewer riders carried them. Abandoned wells silted. Caravanserais that once filled by dusk kept their doors open to empty roads. Even when waves ebbed, the infrastructure did not spring back at once. Skilled handlers, veterinarians, and guides had died. Oasis orchards needed years to regrow. In some valleys, survivors resettled closer to water and left hinterlands to sand and scrub. The network had always been a web, not a single line, but now many threads were cut at once. Detours lengthened journeys and made risk harder to price. A trader who once counted on 6 months end to end now faced a year and a half, with more tolls and fewer guarantees. The lesson was stark and modern. The same corridors that turned distance into profit could also turn pathogens into panics. Genetic work on ancient burials points back to a Central Asian source near 1338 for the dominant strains that swept west, which aligns with the period's climate swings and steppe instabilities. The plague did not invent vulnerability. It exposed how deeply connected the Old World had become. By the late 1300s, the heavy caravans slowed to a shadow of their former pace, and the road's hum dropped to a low murmur that could be missed by anyone not listening. By the 15th century, the road that had tied continents together no longer set the global pace. The traffic thinned not because routes vanished, but because an alternative grew faster and cheaper. Ships replaced caravans as the preferred carriers of value. Port authorities and harbor pilots started doing the work that caravan bosses and oasis guards once did. Insurance contracts began to mention storms and reefs more than raids and toll gates. Navigation manuals circulated among pilots from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, bringing standard methods to lanes that had once been seasonal gambles. In the east, the Mongol Yuan had already fell, leaving a patchwork of successor powers and defensive priorities. In the west, small kingdoms that faced the Atlantic, Portugal and Spain, looked outward because landward options were limited by rivals and mountains. They built shipyards and trained crews to read the sky and water. Mariners blended tools and techniques refined in Islamic and Mediterranean contexts: magnetic compasses, astrolabes, wind roses, and Portolan charts. The result was a working package that let wooden hulls hold a course far from sight of land and return with a record others could follow. The land routes faced new friction. Frontier wars, splintered states, and layered taxes slowed movement and raised cost among Central Asian corridors. The sea route cut across these layers. A vessel leaving Lisbon or Seville could sail to islands off Africa, ride established wind systems, and aim for the Cape. In 1498, Vasco da Gama's passage around the southern tip of Africa closed a circuit that had bypassed the overland middle entirely, linking Europe directly with Indian Ocean markets that had long traded on their own terms. That connection altered the price structure at once. Pepper, a bulk commodity by Asian standards, became the perfect demonstration. One returning ship's pepper sold in Lisbon for a multiple so high that investors saw fleets as profit engines, not gambles. The arithmetic rewarded repeat voyages, fortified islands, and negotiated footholds along coasts from East Africa to India. State treasuries backed expeditions that promised customs revenues without the permission of inland powers. Along the sea, another state had already proven the scale possible. Under the early Ming, Admiral Zheng He commanded expeditions that moved thousands of men and massive tonnage along monsoon paths to Southeast Asia, India, and the Swahili coast. The fleets exchanged gifts, fixed disputes, and logged harbors in detail. Then policy turned. Budgets shifted to border defense, shipyards went quiet, and ocean-facing institutions lost influence. The maps and expertise remained, but they did not drive state strategy. As ocean traffic grew, the centers of calculation moved. Lisbon, Seville, and Antwerp rose as clearinghouses where cargoes, credit, and information converged. Brokers sold spices, silks, and porcelains off the quay rather than in desert bazaars. Time shrank. A route by water could beat a caravan on both speed and volume, and it needed fewer intermediaries to move the same value. Port cities learned to police quality, assay metals, and standardize measures so buyers from distant markets could trust what they purchased. Overland towns felt the change. Some survived by serving regional trade and administration. Others faded when travelers stopped coming. The network did not vanish, it ceded primacy. Ocean monsoons and Atlantic winds became the new schedules that ordered long-distance commerce. The global link held, but its weight shifted west, following currents that carried hulls loaded with goods once counted out by the bale and now tallied by the shipload. By the 16th century, caravans no longer set the limits of global trade. Guns, garrisons, and chartered companies did. Atlantic states tied their fortunes to hulls and monsoons, building a policy of commerce backed by force. What had moved across deserts on animal muscle now crossed oceans under flags and contracts. A route that once relied on local brokers and negotiated passage turned into a chain of forts, customs houses, and company offices that answered to courts in Europe. Shipping timetables replaced caravan seasons. Bullion, bills of exchange, and marine insurance standardized risk in ways camel trains never could. The Portuguese advanced first. After rounding Africa, they struck a line of coastal strongpoints from Goa to Malacca, adding Hormuz and Mozambique to their circuit. Cannons at a harbor mouth could set prices as effectively as any treaty. A small crown, short on manpower, used ship-mounted firepower to compel harbor dues and safe conducts. They learned the monsoon clocks already used in the Indian Ocean and layered their own administrative habits on top. Captains with royal commissions, officers who logged cargo, and chaplains who doubled as scribes. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves filled warehouses that faced the Tagus rather than the Oxus. The Dutch and the English scaled this model into system. Joint stock companies pooled capital from many investors and spread risk across fleets. A charter granted monopolies, legal standing, and the right to wage war in defense of trade. With these tools, the Dutch built Batavia as a command post for the Spice Islands, while the English secured coastal stations in India and along the Straits. Trade routes became schedules backed by barracks and treaties that fixed supply at the source. Ports were no longer mere markets, they were levers for policy. A fleet could blockade, punish, or bypass a rival city and shift regional prices within a season. Inland, the older hubs felt the air go out of the room. Samarkand's bazaars quieted, Merv's canals filled with silt, Kashgar's lodgings counted more empty beds. Scholars moved to provincial courts or coastal centers where ships disgorged foreign books along with cargo. The loudest marketplaces now stood in Lisbon, London, Amsterdam, and Manila. Silver from the Americas passed through these harbors, buying Asian goods with a metal flow caravans had never seen in such volume. Manila became a hinge that linked New World mines to Chinese silks and porcelain, funneling coin across the Pacific and back out into Asian circuits. The cargo looked familiar: silk, tea, porcelain, spices. But its logic had changed. A bolt of Chinese silk could travel under an armed escort belonging to a company that held legal authority over the dock where it landed and the warehouse where it was sold. Contracts specified quantities, weights, and delivery windows. Breaches could trigger seizures or naval action. Merchants who once bargained in caravanserais now dealt in auction rooms and stock exchanges. Profits funded more forts, more ships, and deeper control over production zones. Plantation systems and forced labor entered the supply chain to stabilize output and reduce prices. Yet the memory of the overland web did not disappear. Weavers in Bengal and Suzhou still filled foreign orders. Pepper growers watched distant demand through local middlemen. Scribes in Central Asia preserved texts and languages that had once moved with caravans. The shape of connection persisted even as the lanes moved seaward. At its height, the British East India Company's revenues rivaled European states and dominated a vast share of global trade, a single corporate apparatus sitting where a distributed network had been. By 1800, sand and stone paths had yielded to sea lanes and imperial circuits, but the old road's outline lingered, thin and persistent, under the noise of the surf. By the 19th century, the Silk Road lived mostly on maps and in libraries. Railways hammered across continents, telegraph wires stitched capitals together, and steamers set schedules the desert could not match. Yet a different race began, not for cargo, but for provenance. European academies funded expeditions to trace the bones of a network that had slipped under sand. Governments lent passports and quiet orders. The brief was simple: recover the past before a rival did. The men who went were polymaths with agendas. Sven Hedin sketched basins and riverbeds while negotiating with border officers who changed loyalties with the wind. Orel Stein packed survey chains, cameras, and calipers and paid local laborers who knew how dunes moved and where pottery shards surfaced after storms. Nikolai Przewalski collected flora and fauna alongside place names, his reports doubling as strategic notes. Paul Pelliot read inscriptions on the spot, translating before the light failed. They traveled with guides who set water rations by day and fixed bearings by stars at night. The deserts offered up a ledger of losses and leftovers. Outlines of stucco monasteries emerged from leeward slopes where the wind had scoured the sand. Wall paintings surfaced with pigments that still held blues and reds after centuries without air. Coins lay where markets once counted change, stamped with rulers whose realms had long collapsed. Timber beams, preserved by aridity, recorded construction techniques in their joints. The Taklamakan's margins turned into a field lab where time ran thin and layers came up fast. Dunhuang became the pivot. On the edge of the Gansu corridor, a modest complex of caves held a sealed chamber that a local monk guarded with a mix of caution and hope. When Stein won access, he entered a room where textiles crinkled at a touch and scrolls stood stacked like cordwood. The library cave had been closed for centuries. Inside were tens of thousands of items, Buddhist sutras annotated by generations, colophons that listed donors and dates, contracts that tallied debts in grain and silk, calendars that tracked liturgical cycles, even travel passes marked by officials who once controlled frontier gates. The find altered the study of Eurasia in a week. Scripts ranged from Chinese to Tibetan to Sogdian to Khotanese. Margins held notes in several hands, evidence of copying across communities. Ink formulas varied by region. Paper fibers revealed supply chains of rags and bark. Seals matched known offices and named others lost to memory. Among these, one scroll dated to 868 stood out. The Diamond Sutra, a printed text with a clear colophon, pushing the timeline of printing in a way no conjecture ever could. But the recovery carried a cost that grew clearer with each crate. Permissions were improvised, payments uneven, and custody disputed. Imperial officers signed papers they could not enforce. porters wrapped murals and manuscripts for long hauls to Calcutta, St. Petersburg, Paris, and London. Catalogs appeared before local scholars saw what had left. In the West, exhibits framed the Silk Road as a solved puzzle, even as key pieces sat scattered in far-off stores. 2,000 years after the first caravans set out from Chang'an, the old network resurfaced in a new form. Not footpaths and way stations, but cranes, pipelines, undersea cables, and cross-border rail. The labels stayed the same because the functions stayed the same. Move value predictably across distance. Where camels once carried bolts and bullion, containers now stack on standardized pallets, tracked by barcodes and GPS. Customs clearance happens in data before a train reaches a frontier. Transit times are no longer seasons, they are slots on a timetable measured in hours. At the start of the 21st century, China put a name to this revival and scaled it with state planning. The Belt and Road Initiative bundled projects that already existed with new corridors on land and sea. Dry ports rose at inland junctions. Rail links stitched industrial zones to coastal terminals. Special economic areas offered tax regimes aimed at throughput. Financing came through policy banks and consortia that split risk between lenders, builders, and host governments. Contracts specified track gauge, axle loads, and signaling systems so trains could cross borders without swapping rolling stock at every frontier. On the ground, the map looks familiar in outline but different in machinery. Trains leave Yiwu with consumer goods and components, traverse Kazakhstan's steppes, thread Russian and Belarusian lines, and roll into Madrid's terminals. The trip trades speed for volume against air freight, carving out a middle lane between costly planes and slow ships. Along the coast, ports at Gwadar and Piraeus sit at critical angles on the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean, acting as feeders into inland rail and road spines. Cranes cycle at fixed rates per hour. Ship calls align with rail departures, and inland depots clear containers to avoid dwell time penalties. The names of the nodes changed, yet the logic stayed constant. Control the choke points, and you influence prices, schedules, and political leverage. Pipelines parallel rails to hedge against maritime disruption. Fiber routes shadow highways to bring latency down for finance and logistics firms that price time in milliseconds. Insurance underwriters rate corridors by stability, weather exposure, and redundancy. A single landslide can reroute a chain. A customs dispute can idle hundreds of wagons at a border crossing. States treat infrastructure as policy. Some governments welcome the capital and bet on spillover effects to local industry. Others renegotiate terms or pause projects when debt service tightens or political coalitions shift. Development banks, export credit agencies, and private funds build layered financing stacks that tie repayment to traffic volumes or port throughput. Standards become tools of influence. If your gauges, cranes, and software run on one supplier's ecosystem, switching later grows expensive. In Central Asian cities like Almaty, Tashkent, and Kashgar, the visual contrast is direct. Glass and steel rise near mud brick walls and the ground plans of old caravanserais. Logistics parks cluster beside airports and ring roads. Warehouses install high bay racking and RFID gates to speed cross-docking. Local universities add programs in supply chain management and rail engineering. The skills that once belonged to caravan masters now belong to dispatchers and network planners. The scale is tangible. Today, a container can move from Chongqing to Duisburg over 11,000 kilometers in about 12 days if slots and borders align. That trip shadows a route that used to be a lifetime's work. The Silk Road never ended. It shifted tools and tempo. The next phase will follow the same rule as the first one did. Routes shape outcomes, and whoever sets the timetable sets the terms. The Silk Road wasn't born. It accumulated. Tracks became routes. Routes became systems. Wells, ledgers, and the quiet trust that bound strangers across continents. When you read today's headlines, remember the Bronze Age math behind them. If you want more hidden prequels to famous histories, be sure to subscribe.